Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Truog, Associate Director of the UW-Madison Center for Financial Security. Welcome to today's webinar on Retirement Rules of Thumb. This webinar is part of the Family and Financial Security webinar series sponsored by a grant from the UW-Madison School of Human Ecology Beckner Endowment. Today's webinar is also part of Money Smart Week Wisconsin. Our presenter is John Carl Schultz, Nellie June Gray Professor of Economic Policy, UW-Madison Department of Economics. And our discussants are Brian Bullock, Project Advisor with AARP's Financial Security Team, and Kelly Send, Senior Vice President, Client Services, Francis Investment Counsel. Just quick housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any technical difficulties, please call 1-800-442-4614. And to submit questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar, locate the dark gray bar near the top of Media Site, click on the Ask a Question icon, and a window will open. Please type your name, email address, and your question and hit send. With that, I'll turn things over to Carl.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thanks everyone for being online to participate. Let me try this again now that I have my microphone on. Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you everyone who is online for participating in this event. It's fun to do these webinars, and I'm honored to have a chance to do it. My topic for the day is to talk about a fundamental challenge that people face, and that's to figure out the right amount to save for retirement. That's not an easy question. And since it depends on a lot of things that there's a great deal of uncertainty over, including how long do you expect to live, how much will you spend both while you work and in retirement, what rate of return are you likely to receive on your assets, how much will prices rise or fall in the future, and what is the trajectory of your future health and the associated health expenses. These are all difficult things to know about, and they all fundamentally affect this answer: how much do you need to save for retirement? So while determining the right amount to save is difficult, many are convinced that Americans are just doing an awful job with it. So even a casual look at the financial press, whether Fortune or Money Magazine, Inc., will suggest that Americans are heading like lemmings over the cliff toward improvident retirement. And so what I want to talk about today is what typical households often do to try to figure out the answer to that question, and then propose an alternative, which I think is a superior approach, and where we'd like to go with that superior approach. All right, so current practice, I say rules and tools. Most people, I think, turn to either rules of thumb or online calculators to answer this question: how much do I need to save? A workhorse concept for both approaches is this idea of a replacement rate. The common idea of a replacement rate is that households should be able to replace, say, 75 to 90% of their pre-retirement income to be comfortable in retirement. That number is less than 100% for a couple of different reasons. First, work expenses likely fall. In retirement, you don't need the fancy outfits that you wear to work. You don't need to pay for commuting expenses and the like. Second is that households will often see saving in retirement. Having built up a nest egg, they're in their decumulation phase of the life cycle. Also, a house might be fully paid for. Social Security can be more lightly taxed than wage and salary income, etc. And so these replacement rates are generally less than 100%. Now, there are a number of online financial calculators that people can go to, including ones from Fidelity, AARP, CNN Money, and many others that one can plug in certain individual characteristics and get some output about here's the target for wealth that you need. The savings goals will naturally be affected by pre-retirement income, Social Security entitlements, and other things, but then the calculators will also make their own implicit assumptions and oftentimes ask for additional information. The results of the online calculators can nevertheless leave people scratching their heads. So I have an example here of Melissa and her online experience. So Melissa has unusually simple circumstances. Let's assume she's single, 53 years old in 2012 this year, and has an annual income of $55,000. She plans to retire at age 65, and she has a planning horizon of 87. That is, she thinks she'll live to be about 87. And Melissa, I know her well, is a thorough type, and so she's going to use two different calculators. And in the table, in the slide that you can see the results from the Fidelity calculator using the default options and the CNN Money calculator also using the default options. Fidelity suggests that Melissa needs to accumulate $881,000. CNN Money says she should accumulate $420,000. Now, part of this variation is due to different implicit replacement rate goals. So the CNN Money calculator suggests a replacement rate of 70%. The Fidelity calculator is built with a replacement rate of 85%. But even if we use the 85% number for the CNN Money calculator, Melissa's target is only $610,000, well below the Fidelity target. It's not surprising then that the online calculators can leave people confused. So the question is, are rules of thumb more promising? Well, there's lots of rules of thumb out there that already suggest there may be some cognitive difficulty associated with rules of thumb, but I'll list, or on the slide you can see six common rules of thumb. Things like net worth should equal your age times your pre-tax income divided by 10. Your saving goal should be your expected spending in your first year of retirement times 25. That, of course, begs the question, what is your expected spending in your first retirement year? Another is save 20 times your gross annual income. And you can read down to see these different rules of thumb. In the state of Wisconsin, where we've been facing quite severe financial difficulties, the save half of all raises in your life will end up with quite a small nest egg, I'll add. All right, so I can say two nice things about the rules of thumb. First, they're simple, they're quite simple. And second, they get people thinking about saving, as do the retirement calculators. But there's little solid conceptual grounding for both the underpinnings of the retirement calculators and the rules of thumb. And so that leads me to the idea that there must be something better to do. All right, so the underpinnings of a better way come from the jargon in economics is the life cycle model. So this is something that a scholar, Franco Modigliani, won a Nobel Prize for his pioneering work on this decades ago. Our approach with the life cycle model accounts for uncertain earnings, uncertain lifespan, and uncertain health. But it provides a natural benchmark to this very difficult question: how much should people be accumulating for retirement? So the jargon underpinning the life cycle model is the following: to maximize one's lifetime well-being given their available resources. That is, to make you as happy as you possibly can given the resources that you have. Households should equate the discounted marginal utility of consumption each period. Now, I suspect that phrase is pregnant with meaning for almost all listening, or perhaps not. And so the intuition that is trying to capture is that you want to smooth the satisfaction you get from the last bit of consumption each period. And so I like to think about cookies. I think about cookies a lot. And so I want to think about having a pile of chocolate chip cookies, and I'm trying to allocate my consumption of those cookies over the week. And to make the problem simple, I want to think about cookies that don't get worse with age. That is, they're not depreciating. It's straightforward to recognize that a cookie baked Sunday isn't going to be as tasty on Saturday as it is on Monday, but let's ignore that complication. Now, if I'm talking about my daughters or young children, their solution to how to allocate the consumption of cookies is just to eat them all instantly and have a big bellyache. But what a parent will try to tell them is, well, maybe you want to spread that consumption of cookies out over time. And in fact, if you get less satisfaction from the consumption of a cookie now than you will tomorrow, you don't want to eat that cookie now. You want to save it to tomorrow. And in that way, you want to smooth your consumption so that the satisfaction you get from the last bite of cookie each period is equal over time. That essentially is the kernel of the intuition of the life cycle model, how to approach that saving problem. We want to smooth our consumption over our lifetime so the last bit of happiness or satisfaction we get each period is the same. Then how many resources do we need to accumulate for retirement? It's the resources that allow us to have exactly the same satisfaction from the last bit of consumption in retirement as I do today, accounting for the fact that we value things far off into the future less than we value them today. All right, the solution to this problem then, the mathematical solution to this problem then, tells us the resources needed to maximize our well-being over our lifetime given the resources that we have available to us. So what we do in the research that underlies this webinar is to examine the implications of the life cycle model, household by household, using data from the workhorse data set for aging in the United States, something called the Health and Retirement Study. And what's neat, one of the things that's neat about the Health and Retirement Study is it's linked to data from the Social Security Administration on lifetime earnings. So for most of the participants in the Health and Retirement Study, they have given scholars permission to access their earnings over their lifetime under very tightly safeguarded conditions. And so we know not only how much wealth people have both near and in retirement, but we know the earnings they had, that is the resources they had available to them during their working lives. All right, so with this approach, I'm not going to go over everything on this fairly wordy slide, but just to tell you, we account for the tax system and how it's evolved over time, the transfer system, Social Security rules as they are. People get married and have children as they do in practice. They face uncertain earnings, health, and longevity. And what we do then with this model and our complicated calculations is to calculate the optimal consumption rules for households for any realization of earnings or health shocks that households could face. And so in our model, people could win the lottery, they could have some adverse shock that causes them to be unemployed over time. In any of those contingencies, we calculate how much they optimally should consume in a given year. Once we have this optimal consumption, then we know how much households should optimally save each period, and we can aggregate this saving over their lifetime to calculate how much wealth they should have at the time we observe them in the HRS. We can then compare that optimal wealth they'd have according to our model to the wealth that they actually have to take a stand on whether people are accumulating enough to maintain their living standards in retirement. Now, we can be agnostic about whether people actually make the underlying dynamic programming calculations that our model suggests that they can. The model provides a normative ideal. That is, if our modeling assumptions are correct, we know how much each household should save and consume each period to maximize their lifetime well-being, given their incomes, marriage, and fertility profiles. If they don't do that, they may save more than the optimal amount, they may save less than the optimal amount. It tells us how people are doing relative to this benchmark. So in short, a different way of saying what we've done is we've created sophisticated financial planning software for HRS households that allows us to assess their living standards, their likely living standards in retirement. All right, we've done this for several different years. Our initial paper for this looked at a narrow slice of households, those Americans born between 1931 and 1941. That was the original HRS cohort. And we looked at the year 1992. this work has been ongoing for quite a long time. And there we found a very striking and somewhat unanticipated conclusion. In particular, we found that 84% of households had accumulated more than their optimal wealth target in 1992. That means that over 80% of Americans in that cohort had accumulated enough to maintain their living standards in retirement. Now, that's not to say that households necessarily will be particularly comfortable in retirement. That is, if a household was low income during their working lives, they would be able to maintain their living standards, but they would still have low incomes in retirement. So this is not meant to say everything is perfect in the world or anything like that. This is just a statement about the ability of households to maintain their living standards. What's also interesting, of those who saved less than their optimal targets, the median shortfall was only around $5,000. Now, an important question is whether these earlier results apply to a broader section of American households. And so we've updated our calculations to look at a representative sample of all Americans born before 1954. And we've made a number of other significant improvements in our methodology. And our preliminary results paint a somewhat less optimistic picture, but nevertheless is in contrast to the conventional wisdom that Americans are overwhelmingly failing to prepare appropriately for retirement. All right, so this table, I'll let participants in the webinar read this table or study this table on their own if they're so inclined, but I just want to highlight three items from this table. First, the data that we're using now breaks the HRS sample into several different cohorts. And so I use these acronyms that are common to the HRS for them. The AHEAD cohort, the average age in the sample is 92 years old. So these are very, very old households. CODA is an acronym for Children of the Depression Age. The average age here in 2008 is 81 years old. The HRS, that's the original HRS cohort that we studied for 1992. In 2008, their average age is 72. The war babies, not surprisingly, were children born during the Second World War. Their average age is 64. And the early baby boomers have an average age of 58. For the full sample, the average age in the sample is 75. So going to the second to the last column to the right, you see our bottom line number, and that is that 34% of households in this sample are saving less than their optimal target. So again, there's a non-trivial number of households that are not accumulating enough to maintain their living standards in retirement, but it's nowhere near the majority of Americans. Moreover, the degree to which they're under their targets, the median deficit, is around $20,000. That's not a trivial amount, but it's not an overwhelming amount that is likely to have very large, significant or very large effects on living standards in retirement. Lastly, if you go up and down that second to the last column, you'll see that there is not a great deal of variation across age cohorts in the fraction of the population that's saving less than their optimal targets. The other columns, you can see what these optimal targets are in the means and medians, and you can see in the HRS the net worth that households have accumulated. This net worth includes housing wealth, stocks, bonds, and defined contribution pensions. Okay. It does not include Social Security wealth and defined benefit pensions, though of course the modeling targets, that is what people should optimally accumulate, fully account for DB pension entitlements and Social Security. All right, so we have this somewhat puzzling or contrary view that Americans are, if not overwhelmingly, are largely on track for preparing for retirement. Does that make any sense? And in the interest of time, I only offer one bit of what I think is corroborating evidence to our story, but these are a couple of qualitative, subjective questions also drawn from the HRS. The specific wording in the question is, first, how satisfying is retirement? That is the first 3 columns of numbers in this table. A second question is, how are your retirement years compared to before? And you can see for the satisfying question, which over 8,000 respondents in the HRS answered, overwhelmingly people in retirement are moderately or very satisfied in retirement. In fact, for the full sample, only 8% of households report being not at all satisfied. A much smaller proportion of households were asked the question about your retirement years compared to before, but with this smaller subset of households, again, you can see that only 17% of households said their retirement years are worse than before. That is, over 80% of households are claiming or reporting that their retirement years are better or the same as before. This certainly doesn't prove the correctness of the results that I told you about before, but they are consistent with this idea that largely Americans have done an adequate job accumulating wealth to maintain their living standards in retirement. Okay, let me draw this to a close then. So where do we go from here? So you've heard my conclusion. That is my belief based on the evidence that I presented and a great deal of background evidence that most Americans are on track for financially secure retirements. In work that I didn't talk about today, there's nevertheless some trouble spots, particularly among economically disadvantaged households. That is, if you look at that 30% of households that have not accumulated the resources necessary to maintain their living standards, they tend to be disproportionately minority, low income, with poor levels of education. All right, we continue to refine our model. Most recently, we're modeling health and health investments. And so that's part of our ongoing research agenda. A second part of it, with support from the Center for Financial Security, is to develop rules of thumb that more closely mirror optimal behavior for households in specific circumstances. I'm not very optimistic about teaching a broad swath of Americans the dynamic programming numerical calculations that underlie our model, but yet we think we can generate more straightforward rules of thumb that more closely mimic the optimal rules that would result from the dynamic programming model. One critical omission in a lot of the advice available on the web is the failure to account for children, for example. That is, many households, many people are parents, and you spend a lot of time, income, and resources raising your children. Once they are out of the household, the resources needed to maintain the living standards of perhaps the married couple or the adults that remain in the household is quite a bit lower than the resources needed to not only maintain the living standards of the adults, but also the children. That has implications for how much wealth is needed to maintain living standards in retirement. So what do I tell people now? I don't have those rules of thumb to report to the webinar audience now. This is something that we are working on. So what do I tell people now? Well, first, an optimistic note, that is, you likely are in better shape than you think. If I plug my own circumstances into the Fidelity Retirement Income Calculator, I'll just get discouraged. The targets there are very, very, I'll call aggressive. That is, telling me I need to accumulate a whole lot. And I know, I'm quite confident that the targets they give are quite a bit more than I need to maintain my living standards and my family's living standards in retirement. And I think a lot of people are in better shape than you might think. Then how much do you need? How do you go about that process of finding out how much you need? One, there are a number of very good financial planners out there who will help you. If you're a do-it-yourself type, there's really no alternative, I think, than to track expenses to determine how much you need to live comfortably. Once you have tracked those expenses, then put yourself on a budget and test yourself. Live on that budget for several months. How comfortable are you? Do you have a bit of a reserve to take care of emergencies? And then once you've done those two hard things, trying to figure out your expenses, put yourself on a budget, and then tested the budget, it's quite straightforward to calculate how much wealth is needed to support this budget over your expected lifetime. There are life tables readily available on the web, and so for a given age, you can calculate with a pretty large degree of confidence your expected life expectancy, and then it is fairly straightforward to do present value calculations to find out that wealth target. For those damaged by financial market mishaps or potentially have a late start to this saving game, there unfortunately are no easy solutions. This is the logic of the budget constraint. But the things that one has to think about is potentially to work longer, maybe retire a bit later than the date that you would most like to retire. Another not so much fun is to spend less in retirement. If you have not yet retired, then to try to ratchet down expenditures now, and that is to save more while still in the labor market. Neither of those are pleasant things to none of those three are pleasant things to contemplate, but again, it's the logic of the budget constraint. There's no easy way around it. So thank you very much. I want to thank Nicole Truog for her work with CFS and the webinars. This is really a terrific undertaking that they've done. My friends and colleagues at the Center for Financial Security have been an enormously supportive environment to do work like this. The panel participants, our discussants today, and then I didn't acknowledge at the beginning of my talk, but I should do it now, my frequent collaborator and friend, the person who I've done all of this work with is Anas Shadri, my colleague in the economics department. Okay, and thank you very much for joining this webinar.
Thanks, Carl. Before we turn it over to Brian, there's a quick question that came in here that I think would be helpful. Could you just touch on what categories of assets are included in wealth?
Yes, so the version of wealth that I'm talking about in these wealth targets is a very broad measure of net worth. And so it will include stocks, bonds, certificates of deposit, cash, savings, checkings accounts, net of all liabilities, so mortgage debt, credit card debt, and other kinds of consumer debt. So the targets you see would be financial, real, collectible wealth, less debt, including defined contribution pension balances. What it does not include is Social Security entitlements and defined benefit pension entitlements. Again, the model fully accounts for those, but it takes those as given and then asks how much of everything else should you be accumulating less the appropriate liabilities.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to turn it over to Brian Bullock from the AARP Financial Security Team. Brian?
Yes, thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you all for having us on this fabulous webinar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how, as AARP's educational arm, how we've kind of changed our approach and how we've framed educating our members about preparing for retirement. So as you all probably know, AARP is a nonprofit, a nonpartisan membership organization, and we represent the interests of 50-plus Americans. And we have close to 40 million members at this point. We are a social mission organization ensuring that all folks age with dignity, choice, and control. So the unit, as I mentioned, that I represent, the Education Outreach Unit, our mission is to motivate change through knowledge. And as such, as we see here on our slide, we drive behavioral change by providing consumers and professional audiences information and guidance for informed decision-making and self-advocacy. We develop culturally appropriate strategies and messaging that reflects key needs and interests, and you'll see some of that as I move forward in the presentation. And we have the leading association with best-in-class outreach and educational resources. And then finally, we personalize our campaign issues by encouraging our members and others to tell their stories. We have a database with literally thousands of stories that we have collected over the last couple of years. So the next slide is really just is a sentence that really describes what our challenge has been, and our effort is really focused on answering this challenging question. And the question is, how does AARP increase impact or behavior change and relevance among the 50-plus consumers through financial education and engagement. And just quickly as a background or as a backdrop of why we took on this challenge and wanted to answer this question, ARP does extensive research from both our membership base as well as representative populations. And in particularly, we know that from our member surveys that 85% of our members believe that having adequate retirement finances is important, but only 46% have found success on this issue, and then even fewer, around 37%, find useful resources on this topic that exist now in the marketplace. So, again, among our members, we find that there's really an appetite for this information and for these resources. So on the next slide, it really describes the process that we took to really meet the challenge and our challenge. And the first thing we did is that we defined our target audience. And as you know, the 50-plus population is an extremely large group. You know, there's roughly 80 million people in the U.S. who are 50-plus. So what we did is we broke down this group into segments. And all of our work is around segments. There's not a meeting that we go to around in this building where we're not talking about specific segments. And so at the top of the segment, you see on this slide the 50-plus households, and then we break down that down into two categories, the working or in the workforce, and then on the right-hand side there you see the retired or out of the workforce. And then we further break down the working into two categories, the raising kids, or what we call empty nest, or no kids, emptying the nest, or no kids, the empty nesters. And then we go even further, and we break down into another subgroup, which is really an income overlay of 8 categories. And you see it goes from 1 to 8 there, starting with true blue families, and then on the far right, folks who are in the reflection years. So with our work in the education and outreach financial security team, our work, we address those segments there in that box, segments 2, 3, 4, and 5, the comfortable nest, the blue-collar backbone, the working on and on the go, and the transitioning comfortably. So all of our initiatives, or the majority of our initiatives, we really look at those 4 segments and address the needs of those segments. So in the next slide, I want to describe how we have narrowed the scope. And in order to motivate behavior change, we know that we need to narrow the issue topic. We really have to be really fine-tuned in terms of the topic. So as such, and given who we are as ARP, it's really in our nature for us to focus on the life stage of retirement. So we worked with the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College to really focus on the key financial decisions in retirement which have been identified. And those, as you see on the slide, were when should consumers claim Social Security. And again, this is some work that Tony Webb of Boston College did and some research, and he really uncovered these 3 financial decisions in retirement. The first is, when should consumers claim Social Security? How should consumers produce income from retirement assets, annuitizing assets, optimal asset allocation, or appropriate withdrawal rates? And then the third question is, should consumers repay any outstanding mortgage debt or take a reverse mortgage? So again, much of our resources and tools are really around those three questions that were really pulled out of the academic research at the Center for Retirement Research. On the next slide, in addition to targeting our audience, we really, we also completed additional research to know more about who they are and how they interact with financial decisions as they approach retirement. And this was, unfortunately, I was not directly involved with this as some of my other team members, but I did keep an eye on it. It was really, really quite interesting. And we engaged a context-based research group to conduct ethnographic research that informs the positioning of our financial educational resources with middle-income consumers approaching retirement, the 58 to 62 group. So there were 29 participants in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Baltimore, and Denver. We gave them a number of storybook exercises, and in short, we, as well as interviewed them and did a retirement inventory, and basically what we did in just layman's terms, we looked at this group and really dug deep into how they thought about retirement. And on the next slide, we see a diagram of what netted out. And there was really two main findings: that people didn't want to engage on financial issues when presented from a pure money message perspective. So when we start talking about annuities and all these financial terms, I mean, we literally got a deer in the headlights look, and they really wanted to think about it from more of a life, in the context of life. So retirement, though a still acceptable term for this post-work phase in life, it's really very individually defined. And as such, people really need to first define what their retirement life looks like before they can actually tackle the money needed to support that life. So again, they really looked at their retirement from a life stage, or in the context of just where they wanted to be in life. What do they want when they got to retirement? And again on this slide, you see, and you can look at this at a later time, but I just want to call out the diagram here. We had three groups: the believers, the balancers, and the old schoolers. And of course, the believers really looked more at, they believed that things would work themselves out. They kind of weren't thinking about the retirement in the traditional way of the financial aspect. And then the other end of the old schoolers, who really looked at a traditional financial planning aspect. So again, but I think the commonality with these groups is that they all did look, again, at retirement in the context of their life. Okay, on the next slide, now that we kind of know what who our audience is and how they look at retirement, we developed programs and products. And this Ready for Retirement is our campaign that we started a little over a year ago. And you can see from our tagline there, Ready for Retirement, Tools to Achieve Peace of Mind. And really, again, the messaging is around achieving peace of mind instead of a financial messaging. On the next slide is really the main portion of this campaign, and it's our 10 steps to get ready for retirement. And again, these are, as you look at these steps, they're all around sort of life stages or positions, points in your life. As example, the first step is to really define your retirement. But within this, we do put in some of our tools, and Carl talked a little bit about the calculators that AARP has, and we do have our tools and do promote our tools. But again, we present them in the context of where you are in your life and where you want to be in retirement. And again, so the first step is define your retirement, and in that step we include our AARP Social Security benefits calculator and encourage folks to do a calculation of what their benefit will look like depending on when they retire. Our second step is to take stock of your assets, audit your skills. Third step is to evaluate your health, determine when to collect Social Security. Our fifth step is network through social media and other methods. We know that social media is huge now, and we encourage, again, our members to really get involved with social media. Decide how much you want or need to work. Again, Carl talked a little bit about this in his presentation. And again, we encourage folks to think about this from a more holistic approach of retirement. Then create a retirement budget. Our eighth step, find new ways to cut expenses. And then 9, prepare for unexpected. And then 10, stick to your plan. So again, I know I went through those quickly, but I just wanted to give you an idea that the steps aren't all financially based or beating our members over the head talking about how much you don't have for retirement. Again, it's more from the life context. And it's really been successful, this approach, because it's really prescriptive. It gives steps and it's action-oriented. And again, we found with our research with our members, it's even from the way we title our webinars 3 steps to do ABC or 5 steps to do ABC, or really have been much more successful, and folks have really we've really had greater participation when we do step-oriented initiatives and campaigns. On the next slide is just a screenshot of one of the calculators I talked about, our AARP Social Security Benefits Calculator. And again, this is within those 10 steps as part of one of the steps. And this calculator is, I think, really useful, and it allows folks to customize their estimates. You can calculate spousal benefits, and you can take into account the impact of work, if you're married or divorced, and so forth. And then at the end of it, you get a really nice printable report that you can take a look at. And again, that calculator is at aarp.org /Social Security Benefits if you're interested in taking a look at that calculator. And on the next slide is, again, a screenshot of our retirement calculator, as I mentioned. Again, this is within our 10 steps, and another really simple calculator, requires really minimal input, but at the end of the calculation, it kind of gives you a high-level directional review pretty quickly of kind of where you are and perhaps some suggestions on where you need to go in terms of preparing for retirement. And then the next slide is just, again, talks about our metrics. And the key measure of our success for this outcome really was the number of engagements with targeted AARP personal retirement resources. And our goal last year was around 3.4 million engagements, including 60,000 engagements targeting African Americans and blacks and Hispanic Latinos. And we did actually reach that goal. On the next slide, I just wanted to show an example of our coordinated promotion, and this is a spreadsheet that we operate off of. And the main point here is that we really have to basically bombard our folks in order to get our point across. And we are fortunate enough to have a number of channels within AARP that we're able to leverage with our educational content, from emails to webinars to banner ads, and we coordinate down to the day when and where we place all of our educational resources. So again, this is just an example of what one of those coordinated spreadsheets look like. And then on the next slide, we of course track results quarterly, and which allows us to really make mid-course corrections if we need to. So with that, I will end, and I will turn over the presentation to Kelly.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Kelly, on to you. Do we have Kelly on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry about that.
Perfect. No problem. Okay, Kelly.
All right. Well, good afternoon, all. Thank you so much, Nicole, for having us here today. We appreciate the opportunity to share our viewpoints, and then also thank you to Carl and Brian for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to take a slightly different approach in that I'm going to share with you kind of our perspective from living in the trenches and more anecdotal evidence to understand clearly where kind of the heads are for this pre-retiree crowd. But let me first introduce our firm to you. If you would please page down a couple, Nicole, you'll get to my smiling face. But because this is truly a national audience, let me introduce Francis Investment Counsel to you. Some are familiar and some may not be, but our firm is headquartered in Milwaukee. We are an independent investment advisory practice whose sole focus is on qualified retirement plans. So our customers are employers, mid to large-size employers, primarily headquartered in the Midwest, although our scope is very national because many of our educators really are on planes traveling around and helping participants. Our role is really we really serve in two areas for the employers. First, we serve as investment consultants. So as an independent advisor, we work with plan committees of retirement plans, helping them with the proper care and feeding of the retirement benefit, fund selection, investment policy creation, fund monitoring, and such. And then we serve as employee educators, which is the component of our firm that I lead. I am first and foremost an employee educator and advisor. We are unique, though, in that we are not a wealth management firm or any kind of a broker-dealer. We're strictly an investment advisory practice, and we, are engaged by the employers to provide their employees advice. We have about $5 billion under management or under advisement right now, and in all of our relationships we serve as an ERISA fiduciary, both from a plan sponsor perspective, helping them with fund menu construction and monitoring, but also from a participant level as well. My personal background is, I lead that education group for our firm. I have a master's in adult ed, and so my real focus and passion is really, educating adults with this crazy thing called planning for retirement. And so what I'm going to really talk about today is those rules of thumb, but more from an experience level in terms of what we're seeing out there. In my 20-some years of meeting and doing this, I have met with literally thousands of plan participants nationwide. So I have some unique insights in terms of, when you meet with individuals and families face-to-face for so many years in terms of their emotions, their preparedness, and so on. So I'm going to share with you 4 perspectives, and if you page down, Nicole, you'll see the 4 areas that I will talk about here briefly. The first one is, in our view, people want to retire sooner rather than later, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The second thing we'll talk about is that rules of thumb serve as planning tools. However, there is a lot of shortcomings, as Carl has mentioned. It is our view that workers today ultimately retire when they want to. They're anxious for life after work, not based on when they achieve some magic planning benchmark. And we totally agree with Carl in that, frankly, it's mostly about budgeting. And then lastly, how can we help them, prepare? So you'll notice on the next slide, I'm going to drill down a little bit into item number 1. When I meet with participants, when our team meets with participants nationally, the common question is when do you want to retire? And I will tell you, most of them will say something like, well, how about tomorrow, or something like that. But frankly, I think most people today are interested in and understand that, frankly, without some sort of help through the Social Security system, retirement's not going to happen. And so I think when people say what is an early goal for retirement, I think age 62 is a primary driver. It's interesting because even though the Social Security Administration has increased the full retirement age, to us it's really not a driver. The main driver here is Social Security, and then another driver which we'll get to. But, despite a lot of research, it is our view that workers really yearn for life after work, and that although people say, well, people are going to work longer because they're living longer and they want to be mentally engaged and socially engaged and physically engaged, frankly, many of them say, man, I really just want to, stop working and move on to the next phase. In fact, often workers express a willingness to work part-time. Although some do say that they've regretted it, I think oftentimes when we meet with people that have said we're going to retire early and we're going to work part-time, that part-time work at first seems quite glamorous because it's something new and different, and maybe it's a love, but the reality quickly sinks in that worker is starting at the bottom again in a career that maybe they're unfamiliar with, and at least where they were at their current employer, they were more well-respected. Generally, they like where they work and what they do, and so oftentimes I think people with part-time work are sometimes surprised that that's not nearly as glamorous as it sounds. But so even though people say, I want to go out at 62, in our view, most don't. And I think what really stops them today is health care. And there's a lot of talk today about, well, did the market decline that we suffered in 08 and early 09 stop people or delay retirement? And I don't know that it's so much that as it is, when can I get on the health insurance that I need? And so our key driver that we see is big bad Medicare. When will that kick in, which we all know is age 65, frankly. So bottom line, I think, here is that in our experience, we don't have a bunch of people that are just dying to work longer. They just as soon get out if they could. Now, the second slide you'll see is, the rules of thumb, we really, and as Carl had mentioned, there's a lot of them in terms of the rate of return you're going to earn and the inflation rate and all of that. But frankly, they really boil down to 2 key rules of thumb. And the first one we've talked about already, which is the wage replacement ratios. And I will tell you that we use that whole 70 to 80% rule of thumb, which is I think everybody in the industry does. But what's interesting is that when we meet with plan participants and we say to them, you're going to need 70 to 80% of income, frankly, they laugh. Because they realize, I think most people say, my goodness, there's no way that I'm going to spend this much in retirement. And I think, Carl is on, and his team is really on to something when he says, those needs are different based on number of kids, whether they're going to have a mortgage in retirement, whether they're caring for aging parents. And so that 70 to 80% rule of thumb really, really falls short, in our opinion. And I will tell you, most participants we meet with sort of scoff at it. They think, oh, my goodness, how could that possibly be? Now, it's pretty scary when you do the math on that because, frankly, according to Vanguard, their most recent How America Saves report indicates that the average plan balance in a 401k plan for someone that's at retirement age is $163,000. And so you look at that math and you think, my goodness, and this is where I think you get an awful lot of industry opinion on feeling that, geez, are people, adequately prepared? And frankly, it is our experience that those that are eligible for pensions, which is a dwindling number these days, are frankly much better off than those that are, clearly. I think that's pretty intuitive, simply because a good chunk of that 70 to 80% that they require will be covered by a third source, not only an asset withdrawal, Social Security, but in addition a pension. So clearly we view the wage replacement ratio, as being definitely needing to be more customized for some of these other life parameters that Carl has mentioned. What's interesting to note is that workplace retirement plans, 401ks, 403bs, pensions, are beginning to kind of quantify plan success with this metric in terms of, how is the plan preparing the workers and what percent wage replacement is the plan going to generate. And the major shortcoming here is, frankly, it doesn't include other assets. And with today's more mobile workforce, we see most people have either old 401k plans that they've neglected to roll over, perhaps spousal accounts, perhaps small pensions from maybe military service, perhaps IRAs. And so what we really need to do as an industry is, be able to develop not just based on, okay, well, this is how much is in the plan, but how much people actually have and determine what kind of wage replacement that generates. Now, the second, and the next slide you'll see, the second rule of thumb that we oftentimes use is this whole withdrawal rate question, and that is, okay, I've got X dollars saved. How much can I reasonably pull out a year and not run out of money? And very commonly we hear the 4% rule. That's the term that we've heard. And we use more commonly the 5%. And that math basically says, you know what? If you have your money and you invest it in retirement and earn a 5% rate of return, this is how the math works out, and you pull out 5%, your money's going to last for 25 years. Now you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Kelly. If my money is earning 5% and I'm pulling out 5%, how would I ever run out of money? Well, here's the interesting thing with these rules of thumb, is they provide an annual increase in income to keep pace with inflation. And so year one, you pull out 5%, but year two, you pull out 5%, and then you give yourself a little bit of an inflation raise and so on. So slow but sure over the years, you're pulling out much more than what you're earning, and then that's when the drawdown begins. And that math then says that you're going to run out of money in around 25 years with that 5% withdrawal rate. Now, when I say this to plan participants, what I hear is, oh, that's funny. There's no way I'm going to live until I'm 90, 95. And so plan participants don't understand, and workers today don't really think their life expectancy is going to be nearly that high. And so you get to this sense of, as Carl had indicated, the sense that you need so much more than really what maybe you really do need. Now, all of us do not have expiration dates, tattooed on our back, so we really don't know when we're going to meet our maker. But we do have to try to come up with a little bit better solution to sort of say to folks, this is a more reasonable kind of number. Now, it is our view that a two-tiered income approach would be better, and that is, if I say to a plan participant, you're going to pull out $20,000 in year one, and then $20,300 and so on each year to keep the purchasing power intact with my income, frankly, after about 10, 20 years, that number gets pretty high. And so I've seen studies that have tried to take a two-tiered income approach where we say, let's have the active retirement years, maybe the first 10, where we assume a much higher need, withdrawal rate, wage replacement requirement, and then your quieter years, the last 10 or 20 years. And I've seen studies that have redone the withdrawal rate math and have calculated it more in the 5.5%, kind of 6% range. So what you're going to see is on the next slide is simply, at the end, in our view, both of these rules of thumb, wage replacement and retirement income withdrawal rates, frankly, are helpful. But, we have never met a plan participant that chooses not to retire just because their wage replacement is a little low. And certainly, what, in our opinion, it is, all about the retirement budget. And if someone is a little low and they don't have 70 to 80%, maybe they have 60, in our view, we don't really see it stopping people from retiring. I think people will still retire and then just make the math work. Now, the math gets easier, clearly, the longer they wait because the Social Security check gets higher. But I come back to my main point here, and that is what is the key driver today is not Social Security, it's Medicare. Because most private sector workers do not have retiree health insurance, and that is the huge budget item for retirement. And so when people say, well, if we're going to raise the Social Security age, maybe we'll get people to work longer, I don't know that drives it nearly as much as Medicare. And again, and this is, anecdotal evidence from just doing this for 20-plus years. We certainly see that, having retiree health insurance available allows it. And then also the math gets a lot easier if the house is paid off, clearly, because your bills are going to be a lot less. And so all of these metrics, could be accounted for in more of a custom wage replacement calculation that Carl's group is working on. We see certainly some new trends that could result from this. Workers are going to retire when they want to and not when their wage replacement says they can, and that is perhaps maybe more multi-generational living. You have grandma move in with the adult children, single adults living together trying to split bills, and then even reverse mortgages are becoming more popular. And so I don't see Americans working longer net. I just see them figuring out a way to budget to make it work. So in the last slide here, you'll see kind of how do we get our workers to prepare. And I think the first thing I would suggest is that policymakers, industry folks understand that, frankly, the bigger driver is the Medicare issue, not Social Security. I think as an industry, we can provide workers more meaningful help through, much more of custom rules of thumb as described earlier. But we also have to realize that no matter what we do, this is a very personal custom decision. And so Francis Investment Council believes strongly in participant advice. And in our industry, there's a large difference between participant and advice and education. Education, remember, is just providing you education materials, on-site tools, things like that, or web tools, rather. Participant advice is much more about being, you sit down one-on-one with the plan participant, either live or via web, and tell them what to do and really help them work through all these issues as it relates to their family, help them budget, help them do all of those things. Now, our industry really has two solutions to advice. Online work, where you plug in all of your parameters and it spits out what you should be saving and what a wage replacement ratio would be for you, versus the face-to-face. And it is our view that the only one that really works real well is the face-to-face. And, of course, I say that, we're biased. That's basically what I do for a living, is that face-to-face participant advice. But I think that's the ultimate custom rule of thumb that you can provide people, is giving them on-site help to help them make decisions. In fact, we've done several analyses. On the last slide, you'll see several studies that we have run, over the last 10 years or so, have routinely provided where we've said, okay, let's take all the plan participants that have not utilized this face-to-face on-site advice and the participants that have, and compare their average rates of return, and consistently, study after study, it's well over a 2% rate of return premium for those that are advised, and with double the number of funds, so a lot less volatility. And in fact, we were very pleased to report that a recent study by Ann Hewitt actually quoted a very similar number. So we know it works, and that would be our solution to the ultimate customization of helping people prepare for this cool thing called life after work. All right, so that's it on my comments. Thank you, Nicole. Do you want to open it up for questions?
Yes, thanks so much, Kelly. So we only have a moment here for a question, and I will just start with this one. Carl, could you touch on if your model takes into consideration diminishing living expenses and increasing health care expenses?
It does. So households as they age are getting hit with increasingly large health shocks. And in more recent versions of the model, we also have one's actual health affecting the enjoyment that people get out of consumption. And so we account for that in a very rigorous manner.
Great. And Brian, do you have some thoughts that you could share on how AARP is tracking the number of people who have used your information and are making positive changes?
We do track the number of folks using our tools. Our DSO department, our website folks do track all of that. In terms of the behavior change, of course, has always been very difficult to really track in a scientific manner. But we do have hard numbers of how many folks have visited the websites, how many folks have done calculations, how far they get into our tools if they drop out after the first step, and so forth. So we do have those types of statistics, but beyond whether or not they've actually changed their behavior has always been a difficult thing to track, quite honestly.
Okay, great. At this point, I will just ask if Carl, Brian, or Kelly have any last words that you'd like to share with our audience about anything that we've discussed today.
No, just thank you for participating, and Brian and Kelly for very interesting remarks.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Nicole.
Okay.
Yes, nothing further from me either. If anyone is interested in any of our work or more data, just feel free to reach out to me at bbullock@aarp.org.
Great. And the webinar and the slides will all be archived at cfs.wis.edu within the next week. And our next webinar is on Tuesday, May 8th, 1 o'clock to 2 p.m. Central, and it's on the Wisconsin Poverty Measure. Tim Smeeting will be presenting that report. So look for an email invitation to sign up. Thanks, and have a great day.